The Ball Turret Gunner, one of the most cramped, lonely, and frightening places that a man can possibly fight a war from. The only thing that can make it seem worse, devastating photos like this, taken after a brutal mission to Germany in 1944. After coming across this famous archive image, I couldn't help myself. How did it happen? Did the poor aviator survive? And if so, how? In this video, we will dive into the records and I'll share my findings as we relive this very mission and find out the fate of the Ball Turret Gunner in this iconic photo. Now, as you watch this story, you will undoubtedly find yourself wondering, how do they recreate these missions with such detail? And the answer is the sponsor of this video, War Thunder. War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made, and in my videos, I use their more than 2,500 tanks, planes, helicopters, and ships, spanning more than 10 decades to recreate every story with stunning accuracy. In fact, one of my favorite features is their historic livery options for vehicles. You can even create your own, like we've done in this coming story. It's available on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, or even mobile device, totally free. Join the community of more than 70 million players in epic online battles, and even come and fly with me to help recreate these stories. There's truly no better feeling than flying a combat mission with us, knowing that you're helping to tell the story of a real hero. So don't wait, sign up free at the link in the pinned comment or description and get a massive bonus pack for new and returning players who haven't played in at least 6 months. It includes multiple premium vehicles and an exclusive vehicle decorator for a limited time only. Join now, support TJ3 History, and even come and fly with us. Now, enjoy. In the late summer of 1944, the bombing campaign over Germany is intense. German flak is heavy as the anti-aircraft crews are hard at work to defend their homeland, and the few remaining Luftwaffe aces are battling it out almost daily to try and stop the fortresses and liberators that are now coming by the hundreds. One of the groups that was in the midst of this struggle in late 1944 was the 303rd Bomb Group, also known as Hell's Angels. And if that name sounds familiar, that is because the 303rd was given this name after one of their B-17s of the same name went down in history as the first heavy bomber to complete 25 missions over Europe, and now the entire bomb group boasted the same nickname. One of the many bombers of Hell's Angels was a fortress by the name of Buzz Blonde. Buzz Blonde was a veteran of the 427th Squadron and had a crew who was on the downhill stretch of their combat tour. She was a beautiful aircraft with a flying blonde painted on her side, leading the men to their target and then all the way back home. Her captain and leader was Second Lieutenant Frederick Gano. And while the rest of her crew were no less courageous or heroic, the focus of our video will be on her Ball Turret Gunner, a man by the name of Sergeant Arthur J. Coyle. Coyle, a native of New Jersey, was 25 years old and was no doubt selected, like most, to be the Ball Turret Gunner due to his small size. We can see here from the crew photo that he was on the thinner side, perfect to fit into the small 3-foot diameter compartment of the ball turret. Thus far in the combat tour, he had done his job well, fending off attacks from German aircraft and helping to keep Buzz Blonde safe as her crew attempted to finish up their 25 missions. But now, his most trying mission would come on September 28 of 1944. On this date, the men woke up and headed to their briefing. They were told that their target were factories deep in Europe at Magdeburg, Germany. This would be no milk run, as the crews knew such a long flight would certainly see heavy defenses thrown up. But nonetheless, Frederick Gano and his crew climbed into Buzz Blonde, and pretty soon the 303rd Bomb Group was headed out over the channel towards Magdeburg, Germany. For the first few hours, the flight was quiet, and the men were peacefully admiring the views from 25,000 feet. Sergeant Arthur Coyle had climbed into his ball turret, like he had done many times before, and had begun to scan the horizon for fighters. But at this point, the 303rd Bomb Group was all alone. Eventually, over Hallendorf, the peace was broken. Black puffs of flak began to fill the air around the 303rd and Buzz Blonde. But fortunately, she was in one of the higher formations, which was least vulnerable to this flak. So she escaped this mostly unscathed. But a few minutes later, once the flak let up, a more lethal threat began to climb up through the clouds. Shortly after the anti-aircraft fire ceased, a call went out on the radio. Bandits 5 o'clock low. These aircraft would be Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt Me 109s, and unfortunately for the 303rd, they would prove to be very skilled pilots. Unlike the normal German attack in late 1944, which was executed from head-on, these fighters came in from underneath and behind. This meant that the tail gunner and ball turret gunner would likely have to put in the most work for the time being. Thus, the guns of Arthur Coyle and tail gunner Ed Nelson fired to life and began to defend their fortress. Many times in an air battle like this, things simply came down to the luck of the draw. The interceptors often went for the trailing formation, as they were the most vulnerable and least heavily defended. This group happened to be the 360th Squadron of the 303rd. And by looking at the crew listings and fates for this mission, we can see that the results were tragic. 9 of the 12 bombers in this group would be shot down and killed. Directly from the combat report on the 303rd Bomb Group website, we can read the following.
11 B-17Gs failed to return. They were lost to enemy aircraft after a persistent attack of an estimated 40 fighters. After a bomber was hit, the enemy pilots continued their attack and followed it down. Attacks were chiefly from 5 to 7 o'clock, from low to level, and were concentrated on the low squadron. The friendly fighters arrived to engage the enemy, and during the course of dogfights, sporadic attacks were made. Some crews reported that these attacks were made singly, and others felt they were made by as many as 6 abreast. The tactics utilized by the enemy pilots demonstrated that they were determined, efficient, and experienced.
Fortunately for Coyle, they were in the high flight, making them much safer from aerial attack. But that did not mean that they were out of harm's way. After the attack on the low group, the German fighters then turned their attention to the top formation and Buzz Blonde. In this initial strike, she would be peppered by machine gun fire as well as 20mm cannons. Buzz Blonde would carry on, however, as the German attackers had likely exhausted most of their ammunition on the low formation. But they would take one aircraft from this top flight down. Across from Buzz Blonde was an unnamed B-17 flown by First Lieutenant Charles Glasgow and his crew. It was their 4th mission and the very first mission in their brand new B-17. According to eyewitness reports, the enemy fighter attack here was intense, and the Glasgow B-17 was hit hard where an explosion was seen shortly after. No doubt in the formation nearby, Arthur Coyle and his crew watched as their friendly bomber went down in a ball of smoke and fire. But almost as soon as their friends were seen to go down, the German fighters pulled off their attack and headed for home. Buzz Blonde was shaken and had taken damage, but for now she was safe. And this is where one might be thinking, if the fighters pulled off the attack, when was Arthur Coyle and his ball turret hit? And that would be the same thought that I had in my research, as this looks like a clear hit to the turret from a bullet hole. But then I found out that that might not be the case. Immediately after the fighters pulled back, the sky was once again filled with black. Perfectly timed, the interceptors had left the formation just as the bombers entered another deadly flak zone. And now they were even more vulnerable, entering the IP and preparing to start the bombing run on Magdeburg, Germany. The bombardiers now took over the plane and peered through their sights, while the rest of the crew had to sit it out, watching the German flak get closer and closer, with each burst sending hundreds of metal shards in the air. And it would be here that Buzz Blonde would take her crippling blow. According to the recollection of Buzz Blonde's pilot Frederick Gano, as well as Ed Nelson, her tail gunner, a 3-shot string of flak finally found home and tore into their fortress. The first 2 rounds would hit the nose section of the aircraft, throwing the navigator from his table and tearing into the radio room. Shouts for help echoed through the intercom.
Help! We need help in the nose! We need help in the nose!
At this same moment, a third burst exploded right underneath the belly of Buzz Blonde, and this is where I believe the impact to the ball turret likely happened. In that moment, the shrapnel from the exploding round went flying all across the belly of Buzz Blonde, and one particular piece struck the viewport of Arthur Coyle's ball turret. And while one would think that this hit was obviously fatal, that would not be the case. Another call over the intercom quickly went out from Arthur Coyle.
My eyes, I can't see a thing.
The shrapnel had somehow missed Coyle himself, but instead sent shards of plexiglass flying into his turret and directly into his eyes. Also, in that moment, likely from the same burst, the waist gunner right above the ball turret, Sergeant Robert Berkemer, was hit by shrapnel and badly wounded. With multiple crew members crying out for help and one engine barely functioning, Lieutenant Frederick Gano decided that Magdeburg had to wait, and instead opted to drop out of formation, jettisoning his bombs over Germany and turning back for England. The unharmed crew members began tending to their injured men, and Coyle was pulled from the ball turret and his eyes bandaged as best that could be done. The entire crew was alive, but 3 were bleeding and badly hurt. For Frederick Gano in the cockpit, he was in quite a predicament. He was now alone at lower altitude and with his navigator position knocked out of commission, lost over Germany. But eventually, his navigator was able to reassemble his maps from the blown-apart table and chart them a path, with Gano bouncing from cloud to cloud to try and maintain some form of cover. Still, he surely thought that German fighters would locate them in such an exposed position and finish them off. And after a few long minutes, it appeared that his worst fears had come true. 2 fast-approaching aircraft were sighted and headed right for Buzz Blonde. The able-bodied crew members went to their guns and prepared to fight, when suddenly the radio once again crackled to life.
Hold up, boys, they're friendly.
With the British roundel clearly now visible, the crew of Buzz Blonde recognized the beautiful sight of Spitfires, now slowing up to join the struggling bomber. Waving at their escorts, the crew carried on the rest of the way to the coast, where the Spitfires eventually gave them a tip of the wings and headed on their way. Now free from the threat of Luftwaffe interception, Buzz Blonde limped all the way back to England. Upon sighting the airfield at Molesworth, their home base, the beleaguered B-17 shot flares into the air, signaling wounded aboard. She came in for a messy landing, and medical crews rushed to care for the waist gunner, Sergeant Berkemer, radio operator, Sergeant Mixter, and ball turret gunner, Sergeant Coyle, who had all sustained injuries, landing them all a stay in the hospital. Miraculously, the least injured of these 3 would be Sergeant Coyle, who was able to recover quickly from the plexiglass in his eyes and rejoined his crew in a matter of days. This photo of the Gano crew, actually taken in October of 1944, noticeably only has 7 crew members. That would be because when it was taken, Mixner and Berkemer were still in the hospital from injuries sustained on the Magdeburg mission. Sergeant Arthur Coyle would go on to survive the war, finishing his tour and living to tell of the frightening stories of a ball turret gunner. He would eventually pass away in 2005 at the age of 86. Don't forget to download War Thunder at the link below so you can fly with me and get your free bonus pack. please consider joining my free history newsletter at the link below and get great World War II aviation stories emailed right to you every month. Or go above and beyond and consider joining my Patreon. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.